They wouldn't let anyone back inside the building. Not for clothes, not for medication, not even to turn off the lights that were still on upstairs. Yellow tape crossed the entrance by the time I got home. 2 officers stood at the door, hands resting where they didn't need to be. No one was arguing with them. I asked if it was temporary. One of them shook his head before I finished the sentence. The hallway windows were dark, but I could still see the glow from my neighbor's apartment. The same light that had been on every night for months. The same light no one would explain. They told us to stand back. Then they locked the front door from the inside. I didn't find out what the police discovered until much later. Not that night. Not from an official statement. And not all at once. When they finally explained it to me, quietly, away from everyone else, I understood why the building had been sealed, why no one was allowed to collect their things, why one officer wouldn't look at me while he spoke. Because whatever they found in that apartment didn't start that night. It explained every sound, every smell, every moment I told myself I was imagining things. And once you know what it was, you can't stop replaying everything that came before. What made it worse was the way they kept saying the same thing, without actually saying anything at all. "There's no immediate charge," one officer said. Not to me directly, just out loud, like he needed to hear it for himself. Another officer asked if the building manager had ever reported issues before. When the answer came back as no, he exhaled slowly and rubbed his face with both hands. That reaction stayed with me longer than any detail they later shared. Because if what they found had been obvious, if it had crossed a clear line, their response would have been routine. This wasn't routine. They didn't photograph everything right away. They stood there first, silent, looking, as if they were deciding how much of it they needed to acknowledge out loud. I remember thinking that night would end with flashing lights and a squad car pulling away, that we'd all stand around afterward trading theories, trying to feel normal again. None of that happened. Instead, the officers moved carefully, like they were stepping around something that couldn't be seen from the hallway. They spoke to each other in fragments, half sentences, questions without answers. One of them asked if anyone had complained about smells. Another asked about noises through the walls. Not loud ones, not music or arguments, specific sounds. They didn't write down our answers right away. They listened first, then they looked at each other. That's when I understood that whatever they'd found inside the apartment wasn't alarming on its own, not in isolation. It was alarming because it matched what people had been noticing without realizing it mattered, because it explained things that until that moment had never been connected. Later, much later, someone asked why they hadn't taken my neighbor away in handcuffs. One of the officers paused before answering. "There's nothing to arrest him for," he said. Then, after a moment, "Not yet." That was the first time I felt it. Not fear exactly, something colder. The idea that what they found wasn't the end of something, but a record of how far it had already gone. And that the reason the police reactions mattered more than the evidence itself was because trained professionals were seeing the same conclusion forming. Whatever was happening in that apartment didn't break the law at first. It just waited long enough to make sure it would. Before that night, there was nothing about the building that stood out. It was the kind of place people chose because it blended in. 4 floors, beige paint that never quite looked clean or dirty, carpeted hallways that muted footsteps just enough to make everything feel distant. You didn't hear your neighbors unless you tried to. My neighbor lived 2 doors down. If you asked me then to describe him, I would have struggled. Average height, neutral clothes, the kind of face you forget 5 minutes after passing in the hallway. He wasn't loud, never hosted anyone, never slammed doors or played music too late. He nodded when you passed him. Sometimes he said hello, sometimes he didn't. That was it. Rent was always paid on time. The building manager mentioned it once, almost proudly. No issues, no complaints, no reason to pay attention. And that's the part that still bothers me. Because when you live somewhere long enough, you learn what normal looks like. And he fit into it perfectly. My routine barely crossed his. Morning coffee, evening groceries, the elevator ride where no one speaks but everyone pretends they're not uncomfortable. If he was there, he stood to the side, hands folded, eyes forward. I don't remember him ever having visitors. Not friends, not family. No laughter drifting through the walls, no arguments, no late-night conversations. At the time, that felt considerate. There were small things, though, details that didn't register as problems, just background noise in daily life. Sometimes there was a smell in the hallway, not strong, easy to explain away. Old plumbing, trash left out too long, something from another apartment drifting through the vents. It never stayed, and it never seemed urgent. His lights were on late most nights. That didn't bother me either. People work different hours, people can't sleep. I told myself that meant nothing. Packages would show up outside his door. Small ones, medium ones, always neatly stacked. Sometimes they sat there for days. I remember noticing that once, pausing for half a second before unlocking my own door. Then I forgot about it completely. No one complained about him. No noise reports, no calls to management. Nothing that required follow-up. And because nothing forced attention, no one gave it voluntarily. Looking back now, it's easy to arrange those details into something meaningful. It's easy to say the signs were obvious. They weren't. They were ordinary. They were disconnected. They were the kinds of things you only notice after someone points out how they fit together. At the time, none of it felt important. None of it felt like a warning. It just felt like living next to someone who preferred to be left alone. And that's what makes remembering it so uncomfortable now. Not that something was wrong, but that nothing seemed wrong enough to question.
The first thing I noticed wasn't something I could point to. It was timing. Late at night, after the building settled, I would hear movement through the wall. Not footsteps exactly, more like shifting weight. Furniture being adjusted an inch at a time. It never lasted long. I'd pause, standing still in my apartment, listening, and just as I focused on it, the sound would stop. That made it easy to dismiss. Old buildings make noise, pipes contract, walls carry things they shouldn't. Sometimes it sounded like something being dragged, slow, controlled, then nothing. I remember one night waking up and checking the clock, 2:14 a.m. The sound was there when I woke, gone by the time I sat up. I told myself I had imagined it, that half-asleep state where your brain fills in gaps. It happened again a few nights later, then again. Always late, always brief, always stopping the moment I paid attention. I never heard voices, never heard music, never heard anything that would justify knocking on a door or calling management. Just movement. Once I pressed my ear against the wall. The sound ended immediately. That was the moment I laughed at myself, stepped back, told myself I was reading into nothing, because there was no reason to assume anything else. No argument, no shouting, no clear source. So I let it go. And because I didn't mention it to anyone, because no one else brought it up, those sounds stayed what they were easiest to believe. Nothing worth remembering. The smell came later, and at first it was even easier to ignore than the sounds. It wasn't constant. That was the problem. Some days the hallway smelled normal. Dust, carpet cleaner, stale air. Other days there was something else underneath it. Something sharp, metallic, almost. Sometimes chemical. Sometimes closer to decay, but never strong enough to force action. It would appear without warning, then disappear just as suddenly. People complained about smells all the time in that building. Old pipes, blocked drains, trash chutes backing up. There was always a reasonable explanation ready. I told myself the same thing. The building manager sent out a generic email about plumbing maintenance.
Someone mentioned spoiled food in the trash room. The explanations stacked neatly on top of each other, and the smell slipped through the gaps without drawing attention. I didn't start noticing patterns right away. Only after the police asked their questions did those details rearrange themselves. The smell was strongest on nights when I knew my neighbor wasn't home. I didn't track his schedule consciously, but you notice absences without trying. The hallway felt different when his door stayed closed too long. There were vents running through the walls, thin, poorly sealed ones. Air traveled in ways it shouldn't have. You could smell cooking from 3 apartments away if the airflow shifted just right. Sometimes the smell lingered near those vents. Sometimes it drifted down the hallway, faded near the stairwell, then vanished entirely. I remember standing in the hallway once, keys in my hand, trying to decide if it was worth mentioning. By the time I unlocked my door, it was gone. That became a pattern too. The smell never stayed long enough to prove itself, never returned on a schedule that made sense, never gave me a reason to say, this is wrong, so I stopped thinking about it. And that's the part I can't get past now. Not that the smell existed, but that it behaved like it was careful. Because the smell wasn't the worst part. That came later. It wasn't until later that I realized when my neighbor stopped being background noise and started feeling like a presence. The change was subtle, nothing you could point to in the moment. It began with eye contact. Passing him in the hallway, he would look a second longer than necessary. Not staring, just holding the moment, as if waiting for something else to happen. The first time, I assumed I'd imagined it. The second time, I told myself I was being unfair. By the third, I started timing how long it took before he looked away. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he didn't. Either way, it never reached his eyes. He started mentioning things he shouldn't have known. Nothing dramatic, just small observations slipped into casual conversation. He asked if I'd changed my work hours, mentioned the nights I got home late, commented once on how early my lights went out. I don't remember telling him any of that. I laughed it off. People notice more than they realize, especially in shared spaces. That's what I told myself. Still, I began checking my curtains before going to bed. Not because I saw anything, but because I felt like I should. Once, I was certain they moved after I turned off the light. Just a shift, just enough to make me stop breathing for a moment. When I stepped closer to the window, nothing was there. After our interactions, the hallway felt quieter than it should have. Not empty, muted, like sound itself was waiting. Then there was the question. It happened in passing, late one evening. He asked it casually, as if it didn't matter. "Do you ever hear things through the walls at night?" I shrugged, said no. He nodded, like that confirmed something for him. Weeks later, standing in the hallway surrounded by officers, one of them asked me the exact same question. Same phrasing, same pause afterward. That was the moment the memory locked itself in place. The night everything changed didn't announce itself at first. It began the way the others had. Late, quiet, the building settling into its usual stillness. Then the sounds came back. At first, it was the same movement I'd learned to ignore. Something shifting through the wall, slow and controlled. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. The sound grew clearer, not louder, but closer, as if whatever was moving had reached the shared wall and stayed there. Then I heard something new, a sharp, deliberate knock, not on a door, on the wall. Once, then again. I sat up immediately. This wasn't plumbing. This wasn't the building settling. It had rhythm, intent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for it to stop. Instead, something scraped along the wall, slow enough that I could follow it from one end to the other. When it ended,
The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. A few minutes passed, then voices, muffled, urgent, somewhere down the hall. Doors opened. Someone shouted for help. I never called the police. By the time I stepped into the hallway, they were already there. More than one car, more than one unit. They moved fast, but not loud. No raised voices, no confusion. The mood shifted the moment they entered the building. Jokes stopped, casual questions ended. Radios were turned down, not off, just low enough to keep from carrying. One officer pressed his ear against a door. Another stood at the end of the hallway, watching both directions at once. When they reached my neighbor's apartment, they didn't knock. They closed the hallway doors behind them instead, quietly, carefully. And that was when I understood something was happening that wasn't meant to be witnessed.
They spoke to me in the hallway, away from the others, not loudly, not urgently, calm enough that it almost felt routine until you paid attention to the questions. One officer asked if I'd heard crying. Not shouting, not arguing, crying. I hesitated longer than I should have, long enough for him to notice. I said no. The word came out too quickly, like I'd rehearsed it without realizing. He wrote something down anyway. Another officer asked about smells. How often, what kind, whether they lingered. I gave vague answers. Plumbing, trash, things I'd told myself before. Then came the question that unsettled me most. Had I ever seen anyone go in or out of that apartment late at night? I shook my head, said I hadn't noticed anything unusual. That wasn't entirely true. There had been nights when I heard the door open long after midnight, times when I'd glanced through the peephole and seen the hallway empty afterward. Moments I'd dismissed because they didn't make sense. I didn't mention those. I told myself I was protecting my privacy, that I didn't want to overstate things, that I didn't want to sound foolish. The officers didn't react to my answers the way I expected. No reassurance, no dismissal. They exchanged a look, brief, practiced. One of them asked me to wait by the stairwell, not to leave, just to stay put. As they walked away, I realized something I hadn't before. They weren't asking those questions to gather new information. They were confirming something they already suspected. And the reason that specific question mattered, the one about crying, was because it meant they were listening for something I'd chosen not to admit I'd heard.
They didn't let me step fully inside the apartment. Not at first. I stood just beyond the doorway, close enough to see, but far enough that no one had to explain why I shouldn't touch anything. The place looked ordinary at a glance. Too ordinary. Furniture arranged neatly, nothing overturned, nothing broken. Then you started noticing what didn't belong. Notes were spread across the table, not scattered, arranged. Stacks sorted by size and color, each one filled edge to edge with handwriting. Small, tight lettering, consistent, deliberate. An officer flipped through a few pages, then stopped. He didn't turn another. Along the wall were lists, dozens of them. Times, measurements, short phrases written again and again as if repetition made them more accurate. Another officer crouched near the floor and unfolded a sheet of paper. I recognized the layout immediately. It was the building. Every hallway, every stairwell, each apartment marked and labeled. Lines had been drawn between units, some thicker than others, some with dates written beside them. No one explained what they meant. One officer stood there with his pen hovering over his notebook, unmoving. After a moment, he closed it and set it down. Another officer walked out of the apartment without a word, didn't look back, didn't tell anyone where he was going. When I took a step forward, someone gently blocked my path. Not forceful, just enough. The door was closed between us after that, quietly, like it was important not to draw attention to the moment. No one told me what those notes were for, or why the diagrams were so detailed, or why every date stopped abruptly a few days before that night.
But I didn't need an explanation to understand the shift in the room. Whatever those objects represented, they were enough to make trained officers stop taking notes and start deciding what came next.
The next part didn't happen all at once. It came out in fragments, over time, through conversations that weren't meant to include me. I heard it first from the building manager, pulled aside by an officer near the stairwell. Their voices were low, measured. Something about the lease wasn't right. At first, it sounded like paperwork, a clerical issue, the kind of problem that gets fixed with a phone call and an apology. But the longer they talked, the quieter they became. The apartment had a lease on record, then it didn't. Dates overlapped where they shouldn't have, months accounted for twice, others missing entirely. The building manager kept insisting someone had been living there, rent had been paid, keys had been issued. The officer didn't argue, he just asked him to repeat the dates again. Utilities raised more questions. Electricity usage spiked at hours when no one should have been home. Long stretches of activity in the early morning, then nothing for days. Water running late at night without a pattern that matched normal living. Someone pulled up records on a tablet and stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then they handed it to someone else without saying a word. What unsettled me wasn't the errors themselves. It was the way the officers reacted to them. No frustration, no confusion, just a quiet recognition that the numbers lined up too well with what they had already seen. One of them said it almost under his breath, like stating a fact rather than a conclusion. No one should have been living there. The sentence hung in the air longer than it needed to, because we all knew someone had been. The footage came last. Not because it was hidden, but because no one wanted to look at it until they had to. The building had cameras in the common areas, hallways, stairwells. Nothing inside the apartments themselves. Standard setup, nothing invasive. An officer pulled the recordings up on a small monitor near the front desk. No one crowded around. They stood back, arms crossed, watching from a distance. The footage looked ordinary at first. People coming and going, delivery drivers, residents passing through, heads down, phones out. Then the gaps appeared, short ones, minutes missing where there shouldn't have been any interruption. Not random, clustered around the same late-night hours. Someone pointed it out quietly. The cameras hadn't failed. They'd been disabled, briefly, cleanly. The recording jumped forward, resumed, then cut again a few nights later. When the footage returned, the hallway was empty. Then I appeared, walking down the hall, unlocking my door, standing outside my apartment longer than I remembered. I didn't react to anything, didn't look around, didn't hesitate. I was just there. It happened again on another night, different time, same calm routine. I was in the footage far more than I expected to be. Always alone, always unaware. One officer leaned closer to the screen. Another stepped back, folding his arms tighter. They didn't comment on what they were seeing. They watched my movements instead. When the footage cut out again, no one rewound it. No one asked to see it twice. The reaction mattered more than the recording, because whatever the cameras showed, it wasn't surprising them. It was confirming something they'd already accepted. By the time the footage ended, the decision had already been made. The apartment wasn't treated like a crime scene. There were no evidence markers lining the floor, no technicians moving in and out with equipment. Instead, they sealed it. Plastic sheeting went over the doorway. Locks were changed. The hallway outside it was cleared completely. It was handled like a place that wasn't meant to be disturbed again. Someone asked the question everyone was thinking: why no arrest had been made, why no one had been taken away in handcuffs. The officer who answered didn't hesitate. There's no crime yet. He said it the same way you'd explain a technicality, as if the meaning was obvious. No one argued, no one pushed back,
because the fear in the room didn't come from what had already happened. It came from what was being interrupted. The apartment wasn't sealed to preserve evidence, it was sealed to stop something from continuing. I noticed how often the officers checked their watches after that, how they kept glancing at the closed door, then at the hallway cameras. They weren't waiting for paperwork, they were watching the clock. That was when it became clear why no arrest had been made, why names weren't being shared, why explanations stopped short. If no crime had occurred, then their urgency wasn't about justice, it was about timing. And whatever they believed had been happening in that apartment, they were afraid it wasn't finished yet.
The last truth came out slowly, not in a room, not in an announcement. It came in pieces, spoken too softly to stop. The lease for that apartment had ended months earlier. No renewal, no extension, no new tenant on record. The building manager checked twice, then a third time. There was no legal reason for anyone to be living there. Utilities told the same story. Electricity usage didn't line up with any approved lease period. Water had been running during weeks the unit was officially vacant. Activity logged at hours when the building should have been asleep. None of it matched the version of reality we'd all been living with. That was when everything shifted. The polite greetings in the hallway, the way he knew my schedule, the eye contact that lasted a second too long, reframed, the sounds through the wall, the movement that stopped when noticed, the dragging that never quite repeated the same way twice, reframed, the smells that came and went, that appeared when no one was supposed to be home, that followed airflow patterns too precisely to be accidental, reframed. I thought back to the packages outside his door, untouched for days, as if they weren't meant for someone inside. I thought about the nights the hallway camera showed me standing outside my apartment longer than I remembered, still, unaware. And finally, I understood what the officers had already accepted. The person I thought was my neighbor was never a tenant. The routines weren't signs of normal life. They were markers, timelines, observations. Whoever had been paying attention to me, to the building, to the patterns inside it, was never supposed to be there. And the most unsettling part wasn't realizing I'd been watched. It was realizing I'd been watched by something that didn't need to live next door, to know everything about me.
The building reopened a few days later. Most of it, anyway. That apartment stayed sealed. The tape never came down. The door was never replaced, just reinforced. Management stopped answering questions about it altogether. There was no public report, no notice slipped under our doors, no explanation for why one unit on the third floor no longer existed on the floor plan posted near the elevator. People moved on faster than I expected. Some tenants left. Others stayed and stopped talking about it. I stayed. My routine didn't change much. Same hallway, same elevator, same muted carpet absorbing footsteps at night. But the building feels different now. Not louder, not quieter, more attentive. I still notice patterns, airflow through the vents, lights turning on in apartments I know are empty, sounds that don't repeat once I stop walking. Sometimes I catch myself standing still, listening longer than I need to. The sealed door never makes noise. That's what bothers me. I don't know what's gone, or if anything ever really left. I just know that whatever was paying attention before didn't need permission to be there, and that makes it hard to believe the story is over.
I've gone over everything, more times than I can count. The sounds, the smells, the moments I chose not to question because they were easier to ignore. I keep wondering which detail mattered most, which one should have stopped me sooner. If you had lived there, walked those same hallways, heard those same noises through the walls, would you have noticed the signs for what they were? Or would you have done what I did and explained them away until someone else stepped in? There are things the police never said out loud, details that didn't make it into any report, reactions that felt heavier than explanations. I still don't know what they decided not to share, or why they were so careful with their words. If you think something was missed, or if you think you understand what they were afraid of, say it. Because the most unsettling part of all this isn't what was found in that apartment. It's the possibility that some of us noticed more than we realized and didn't know what to do with it.
Before you leave, think about the details that didn't quite fit. The sounds that stopped when noticed. The questions the police asked twice. The apartment that was sealed instead of cleared. If you had lived there, which sign would you have paid attention to first? Do you think the police told us everything they found? Or do you think some details were left out on purpose? And one more thing. Where are you watching this from right now? An apartment? A house? Somewhere quiet? Because stories like this don't just happen in one place. They happen wherever people decide something feels normal enough to ignore. Leave your thoughts below.